Hi, welcome to No Water River and the 5th episode of the History of American Children's Poets of the 20th Century with Lee Bennett Hopkins. I welcome again Lee. Hello, Lee.
Hello, Renee.
In this episode, we are diving into the groovy 60s where we have 14 poets. So there was an explosion of poetry, apparently. And 3 of them we have already covered in our NCTE award winner series. So we'll, hop over them a little bit. And the rest, let's see what Lee has in store for us. I'm handing it over. Off you go.
Yeah, it was a curious decade, and you said it really was kind of an explosion. We can start in 1960 with Kay Starbird, who was born in Sill, Oklahoma. And while still in college, she was published in magazines such as The New Yorker and Good Housekeeping. She actually began writing when she was 8 years old. Primarily a writer of adult poetry. Her first book of poetry for children appeared in 1960, Speaking of Cows. She did 4 additional collections, each marked with very droll and imaginative views on a variety of subjects, from a winter blizzard to a spelling test to verses about eccentric people such as Miss Casper, who keeps a second cow in her 2-cow garage. In total, Kay Starbird wrote 160 poems, not as well known as some of the other poets, but did make her mark with that amount of work. She died in 1993 at the age of 77. 2 books of poetry for children also appeared in 61 by famed poets. Aaron Estlin Cummings, better known as E.E. Cummings, who was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1894. He wrote more than 2,900 poems. Incredible. In addition to writing in other genres. His first work for adults, Tulips and Chimneys, came out in 1923. Hist Whist and Other Poems for Children contains 20 verses, including the oft-anthologized In Just Spring When the World Was Mud Luscious. Collections of his work continue to be published by children. He died in 1962 at the age of 67 of a brain hemorrhage. Theodore Rothke's I Said the Lamb was also published in 61. The Pulitzer Prize winning poet was born in 1908 in Saginaw, Michigan. He died of a heart attack at the age of 55. It seems odd that they died so young. A decade later, his wife, Beatrice, compiled a book of his work called Dirty Dinky and Other Creatures, which is 27 verses culled from his various works. 1961. Mary O'Neill indeed brought color to the world of poetry via Hailstones and Halibut Bones, Adventures in Color. 12 poems each with a compelling sense of rhythm. Where brown is as comfortable as love, where breath is white when you blow it out on a frosty night. Several books followed, including People I'd Like to Keep and Fingers Are Always Bringing Me the News. Mary O'Neill was born in New York City. She died in 1990 at the age of 84. 1962, Eve Merriam debuted with There Is No Rhyme for Silver. And again, recipient of the 1981 NCT Poetry Award. Her work is highlighted as part of our spotlight on NCT poets. So go to that tape and you'll learn all about Eve Merriam. Patricia Hubbell was born in 1928 in Easton, Connecticut, where she has lived her entire life. 1963, and I don't have the actual jacket cover, but this book, it's hard to see, called The Apple Vendors Fair debuted. And what a debut it was. 41 sterling verses, frogs, fire, even a washing machine come alive. Her work is incredible. And I know you're going to share the opening poem, Autumn, from the Apple Vendors Fair.
Yes, indeed, which is really charming. Thank you for sending this because I have not read this poem before. So this is Autumn by Patricia Hubbell. The clock is striking autumn at the apple vendor's fair, and the fruit is hanging heavy on the bough. Up among the branches, a summer bee still sings, but winter is a whisper in its wings. For the clock is striking autumn at the apple vendor's fair, and the apples that are hanging soon will fall. And the white cocoon of winter weave around the bending trees, and the apples will lie broken on the ground.
Very beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm lucky to know Patricia. I once asked her why poetry, and she answered, because poetry is the taste of hot chocolate on a cold, starry night when the full moon is flashing her light down on a frozen pond. It's the rumble and hiss of the subway, the bop, bop, bop of the basketball dribbling down the court. It's everything you see, hear, touch, smell. It's the things you think, the things you imagine. It's life. It gives me shivers. I still shiver at her work. I go back to it often. I've used Patricia in many of my anthologies. Next, we can discuss Lois Lenski. Although she had written poems since her first publication in 1927, it wasn't until 1965 that her collected poems, The Life I Live, appeared with her own illustrations. It's a hefty volume, as you can see, with 368 poems, quite a book. Lois was born in Springfield, Ohio in 1893, the fourth of 5 children. In 1927, her first book, Skipping Village, was published. She continued to create a numerous body of work for all ages, including the 1946 Newbery Award-winning book, Strawberry Girl. In an interview with her, I asked about letters she received from children, and she said, I get an avalanche of letters, and I answer each one in longhand. Can you imagine? An example is this one that I received from her back in 1969. Again, you know, she didn't type, there were no computers. Everything she did was longhand. I think it's incredible. About the life I live, she stated, this is the happiest of all my books. Into it has gone a lifetime of love and devotion to children. Lois died in 1974 at the age of 80. Also in 65, Barbara Jester Espison, her first book, Swing Around the Sun, was published. She received the 1994 NCT Poetry Award, and again, her work is highlighted as part of our Spotlight series. Moving on to Charlotte Zolotow. Most people know her work as an author of many, many children's books, but also she did a great deal of poetry. Charlotte was born in Norfolk, Virginia in 1915, and her first book of poetry, All That Sunlight, came out in 1967. In addition to creating this book of 22 poems, she's a legend in the field of children's literature, who worked with Ursula Nordstrom at Harper her whole career. As an author, as I said, she created a wide variety of books, including the classic William's Doll, which was published in 1972. As an editor, she worked with a who's who of authors throughout the country, including Margaret Weiss Brown, H.A. Ray, Garth Williams. The list goes on and on. Charlotte was a beloved friend of mine and published many of my own anthologies. In 1984, we created a book called Surprises, which was the first I Can Read book of poetry, which is still in print after 35 years. In 1987, I compiled this collection, Everything Glistens and Everything Sings, under her guidance, a book of 72 poems. One of her classic poems, which has been anthologized many, many times, is so beautifully written. It's called People. Share it with us.
I will definitely do so. I love this poem. I have never read it, and I'm going to put it in the blog post as well, because it's really a keeper. So this is People by Charlotte Zolotow. Some people talk and never say a thing. Some people look at you and birds begin to sing. Some people laugh, and yet you want to cry. Some people touch your hand and music fills the sky.
And that was Charlotte. Charlotte was married to Marie Zolotow, who did the first biography of Marilyn Monroe. Her daughter, Crescent Dragonwagon, follows in her mother's footsteps as an author and promoter of children's books. In a book she did called River Winding, published in 1970, the poem Missing You appears. The last lines read, "Now I walk along the bank, the water's very blue, and I am walking by the waves, missing you." Charlotte died in 2013 at the age of 98. I still miss talking, walking, and working with this woman who was indeed all that sunlight. We end 1967 with the publication of Lillian Moore's first book of poetry, I Feel the Same Way. Again, winner of the 1985 NCT Poetry Award. Her work is highlighted in our Spotlight series. Moving on, we have Jack Prelutsky, who came on the scene in the 60s. Everyone knows he's a prolific writer of light verse, created numerous titles and a variety of anthologies. Born in 1940 in Brooklyn, New York, he became the first United States Children's Poet Laureate, which has now been renamed, by the way, the Young People's Poet Laureate. His combined work has sold over 1 million copies, and his work has been translated into many, many languages. It was Susan Carr Hirschman, who was an iconic editor who not only encouraged him to write, but took him under her wing. He was working in Greenwich Village in a bookstore. He also sang in cafes in Greenwich Village and really had no money. Susan provided him with an advance to be able to pay his rent, and she arranged for an advance payment for his first book. She also took him to lunch once a week in Macmillan's corporate dining room, but only with the agreement that he'd bring her one poem to lunch each week. Thus, his first book, A Gopher in the Garden, was published in 1967. I've known Jack from the time he became published. In an interview with him, I asked him, what is poetry? He replied, good poetry tells you something, then stops. There's no wandering. It catches your heart, your mind. I like to tell children that a good poem is delicious as a chocolate chip cookie. Jack lives with his wife, Carol Lynn, in the state of Washington. In 1968, only one book of poems appeared, a book of 42 very sophisticated poems written by a 12-year-old child when she was 9 years old. This is Aliki Barnstone's The Real Tin Flower. The foreword to the book was written by Anne Sexton, the 1967 Pulitzer Prize winner. Born in 1956 in New Haven, Connecticut, Aliki Barnstone went on to write many books of adult poetry. She didn't do any more children's books, and she became and is the poet laureate of Missouri, where she now lives. 1969 marked the debut of June Jordan. June Jordan was born in 1936 in Harlem in New York City and began writing at the age of 7. It was in 1969 that her first book for children, Who Look at Me, was published, a collection of works depicting interracial relations and African-American experiences. About this book, she said, we do not see those we do not know. And in a nation suffering fierce hatred, the question race to race, man to man, and child is, who look at me? We answer with our lives. Let the human eye begin unlimited embrace of human life. Now, that was a statement made back in the 60s. I think we're still making the same statement today, unfortunately. June Jordan continued to write, edit, and anthologize a variety of books. Unfortunately, she died young in 2002 at the age of 65 after a 2-year battle with breast cancer. One just wonders, when some of these people die that young, what they could have created and what they could have given to the world of poetry. Well, we end the decade with Farther Than Far by Margaret Taylor, which is a book of 40 poems. Margaret was born in Saginaw, Michigan, and wrote poems while in 3rd grade. She studied to be a nurse, but ended up teaching 1st grade for 34 years. Margaret and I were very good friends who corresponded for years. Being around her was like being at the best poetry party. She sparkled. Unfortunately, she died in 2014. I think to close the decade, it would be appropriate that you share the title poem, From Farther Than Far.
With pleasure. Before I do want to thank you for this amazing amount of research that you've done. Just sitting here listening to you, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, that must have taken a really long time. So I appreciate it.
It's a lot of work.
I know, but we do appreciate it. So we will close the 60s with this beautiful poem by Margaret Hillard called Farther Than Far. I look into the sky and see the leafy branches of a tree, and higher still a bird in flight, and higher still a cloud of white. Beyond the cloud is lots more sky, farther than far, higher than high. And where it ends, another place is filled with space and space and space.
A lot of these
Beautiful.
Poets that we talk about in the 60s, a lot of their work is out of print. But with today's technology, we can find these books on various sources on the internet, and they're worth looking for.
Absolutely. I know after we, finish this and I do the post-production part of the series, I do spend a lot of time hunting down poems to share in the blog post. And often it's really hard for me to choose, because I don't find a lot, but the ones that I do find are usually, it's hard to choose which one to use as a representative poem of that poet, because there are just so many treasures hidden out there on the interweb. So I do encourage anyone, if there's a particular poet that strikes your fancy, to just do a little bit of searching, and sure enough, you'll find something. Poemhunter.com, for example, is one place that has a lot of children's poems by just everybody, basically everybody. You won't find a lot of these on the Poetry Foundation because they don't seem to list a lot of poems for kids, if any. Well, they do, but not a lot. Let's put it that way. So, yeah. There are many, many resources though out there, and I do encourage people to, look a little further to see what you can find for some of your favorite poets. So.
Yeah, and our next episode will feature poets of the 1970s. Has anyone ever heard of Shel Silverstein?
Rings a bell. So. All right. Well, I look forward to the 70s. How many poets, more or less, do we have in the 70s?
I haven't added them up yet, Renee.
Okay.
There were quite a few. And I thank you for the research you do.
No problem. All right. Well, I'm going to close down this session of the history of children's poets of the 20th century, thanking you once again for the immense amount of work that you're putting into this. And we will see all of you hopefully back here for the 1970s. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye, Lee.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.